Let's go. So, brief introduction. This is Dr. Eleanor Fleming. You guys can read her bio in the registration brochure. But she's one of my favorite people. She is a phenomenal speaker and presenter, and it is all a treat for you to see her today. So, thanks for bearing with us as we work through our technical difficulties. I won't take any more time away from Dr. Fleming.
So, good morning, and my apologies for being a technological. I was just on the struggle bus today, so my apologies. But let me get into this. It truly is an honor for me to share some thoughts on how we can reimagine dental public health. So I want to acknowledge the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Anacostan and Piscataway on which I'm presenting today. Please take a note to honor these ancestral grounds and the grounds where you sit to participate in this colloquium. Together, let us acknowledge the strength that all Indigenous people have shown worldwide. Let us also acknowledge that on August 4th, 1964, the bodies of Michael Sherner, James Chaney, and Andrew Goodman were found in Lawndale, Mississippi. You will recall that they were working with the Congress of Racial Equality Corps, registering Black U.S. citizens in Mississippi to vote when they went missing. And of course, we have to acknowledge that Breonna Taylor's murderers have yet to be charged. You will recall that on March 13th, 2020, Breonna Taylor was fatally shot by Louisville police officers Jonathan Mattingly, Brett Hankinson, and Miles Cosgrove in her own home. Now, at this point, someone must be wondering, what does land acknowledgement, civil rights history, and hashtag say her name justice for Breonna have to do with reimagining dental public health? I argue everything. I was taught by Dr. James Tyus at Meharry Medical College that dentists don't treat teeth. Dentists care for people and communities where people may or may not have teeth, but still need oral health care. If we are to imagine dental public health, we must see people, their history, their culture, and the current state of our world. I won't bore you with a list of those issues, but allow me to share words from Bell Hooks in Killing Rage, Ending Racism. All our silences in the face of racist assault are acts of complicity. Hooks also argues there must be a paradigm, a practical model for social change that includes an understanding of ways to transform consciousness that are linked to efforts to transform structures. Let me be clear. It is time for dental public health to be woke. So if we are to be woke, let's start by waking up and reviewing the terms of this colloquium: resilience and community. So here's a definition of resilience: the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Toughness: the ability of a substance or object to spring back into shape. Elasticity. Resilience: I'm curious how you see resilience to operate in dental public health. In the world that I live in, being said that I'm resilient is almost a backhanded compliment. My grit and perseverance as a Black woman to work in toxic environments and deal with microaggressions and white privilege makes me resilient. But dental public health? I don't know, like, are the specialties questioning our street cred? And I bring this question because if we are to be resilient, and are we calling communities resilient, should we not focus on the root causes that cause them to sometimes have to work twice as hard to get half as far, or to deal with the barriers that impede not only their oral health, but overall health? Resilience. Now, community. Now, this one is a little bit easier to apply, right? A group of people living in the same place are having a particular characteristic in common, a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common attitudes, interests, and goals. So what do resilience and what does community, what does it mean for reimagining dental public health? Personally, I think that this is a deeper question for the larger profession of dentistry and perhaps public health. So prior to becoming a dentist, I was and still am a political scientist. I studied American politics and political theory. So when faced with terms like reimagining, resilience, community, I immediately think of democratic theory, specifically social contract theory. How do we work together to imagine and be woke hinges upon how we see ourselves as signees to a social contract vis-a-vis the public. Now, this idea of dentistry social contract is not new. In fact, Mueller and Nunez published an ethics piece in Jada. I always want to call it Jada because I have a friend named Jada, but it's actually Jada, so forgive me. But they published an article in May arguing, although the profession historically mirrors medicine in its primary purpose to serve the public and people through the control and prevention of disease, the competing forces and interests between dentistry as a profession and a business demand that dentists and their associated institutions examine dentistry social contract and ask what the role of dentistry is in today's society. Mueller and Quinez used Thomas Hobbes and his Leviathan to frame their understanding of the social contract. They suggest that we exchange some freedoms for the protection of rights. They write, there must in turn be an implicit agreement that guarantees trust and respect between the two parties and preserves this confidence in the profession more broadly. Thus, by extension, a healthcare profession's social contract, including dentistry's, is a matter of social institutions and play out in their many structural forms. Hence, dentistry social contract is found in legislation, codes of ethics, and licensing. Now, Hobbes wrote the Leviathan during the English Civil War, and the idea that one would enter into a social contract for safety and protections. Hobbes sees the individual as in a state of war where one feels being killed for their property, rather one fears being killed for their property. To reimagine dental public health, I argue that we need another view of the social contract, one based in justice, where we enter into the contract not fearing for our lives, but seeking a fair community. Enter John Rawls, who in 1971 wrote a theory of justice, and his justice is fairness, to bring political morality to the foreground. So how might we move from fixing teeth to treating a community? Justice is fairness. How do we engage in land acknowledgement, civil rights, and police violence, in addition to... So briefly, Rawls sets up a thought experiment called the original position. In this original position, we argue our social contract about political, social, and economic structures and establish basic liberties and accept certain differences. In Justice is Fairness, a restatement, the original position is understood as a device of representation. As such, it models our considered convictions as reasonable persons by describing the parties, each of whom is responsible for the fundamental interests of a free and equal citizen, as fairly situated and as reaching an agreement subject to appropriate restrictions. So what are the principles of justice? Each person has the same indefensible claim to a fully adequate scheme of equal basic liberties, with the same scheme of liberties for all. So, in a nutshell, what was I arguing? I was arguing that our social contract needs to be built on justice. There's a framework of justice called Justice is Fairness that basically says that we support a fair equality of opportunity, and a difference of principle, where none of us would allow anything that would impede our ability to access dental care as a right, as a form of justice. Furthermore, whether we're thinking about transportation, housing, public works, or anything that would be a structure that impedes our ability to have a fullness of health as a part of justice, we sign on to. We sign on to as dentists, as citizens, and we work with communities as citizens in that same agreement. Now, if we take in our current moment that we're trying to figure out how to move from this idea of dentistry as being a business model, as being based on a social contract where we agree to give up our freedom, so basically dental providers can serve as business owners. No, we actually embrace a framework that looks to liberal socialism as for us to see ourselves as dental public health and a community that are equally yoked to do this work. Now, to do this work as it relates to practicing anti-racism and to undergirding systems of oppressions and institutions that support racist ideologies, here I argue that we need to tackle racism through the 3 E's. The E's of to educate, engage, and affect. The idea here is that we learn, read, listen, and observe and understand that color blindness does not fit. We come to this conversation, perhaps it's new to us, but it's not new to people who've been doing this work for a long time. We engage in authentic relationships, which means that we engage on difficult issues, listen more than we speak, and have purposeful conversations to figure out who's in the room, who's not in the room, and who needs to be included. We affect transformational change. We're here, we try to find ourselves in a unique place in the ecosystem where we can leverage our power, privilege, and access to be both an advocate for racial equity and also a racial equity broker. And finally, we give up this idea of just being an ally to figuring out how we can be an accomplice. So how can we do this work of bringing attention to, again, who's at the table and who's not? And I have this whole argument laid out, and I guess because of technical issues and what went wrong, I couldn't give it. So if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share, but I think that is all we have time for.